Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today, we're taking a look at AMD's FSR 3 technology, which had a surprise debut last week in Forspoken and Immortals of Avium. There's a lot to cover in this video, including a discussion on frame pacing, image quality, and latency, so without further ado, let's get started after a word from today's video sponsor. Today's video is sponsored by ASUS and their excellent ROG Swift OLED PG27 AQDM gaming monitor. In our testing, we found the PG27 AQDM to be the best 27-inch 1440p 240Hz OLED monitor on the market. Not only does it feature the excellent black levels, lightning-fast response times, and per-pixel local dimming that we've come to love from OLED, but it's also the brightest model for HDR gaming with this panel that we've seen yet. This is a truly excellent display that delivers speed and motion clarity for multiplayer gaming, as well as stunning HDR visuals for single-player gaming, all in the one package. To learn more about the ASUS PG27 AQDM, click the link in the description below. So Fidelity FX Super Resolution 3 is AMD's answer to NVIDIA's DLSS 3, which back in 2022 introduced frame generation support for RTX 40 series graphics cards. The idea here being that between each normally rendered frame generation creates an interpolated frame to improve the apparent smoothness of the game's presentation. FSR 3 introduces frame generation tech that's pretty similar to DLSS 3 frame generation in its functionality and goals, with AMD now finally willing to release the tech after announcing it on November 3, 2022, just under 11 months ago. The main difference between FSR 3 frame generation and DLSS 3 frame generation at a surface level is compatibility. DLSS 3, as I said, is exclusive to NVIDIA's RTX 40 series graphics cards, with NVIDIA believing that only the new Ada Lovelace architecture has the optical flow accelerator performance necessary to drive frame generation. FSR 3, on the other hand, is available for all graphics cards, with official support for AMD's RX 5000 series and NVIDIA's RTX 20 series and above. AMD are effectively claiming that they have an optical flow frame interpolation system that is performant enough to not require specific hardware accelerators, which certainly disrupts the GPU features race provided it actually works well. As of today, we have two games with FSR 3 frame generation support, Forspoken and Immortals of Avium. Enabling the feature is as simple as turning on FSR 3 upscaling and then turning frame generation on in the game settings. Unlike with DLSS frame generation, FSR 3 frame generation requires the use of FSR 3 upscaling, so you are tied to FSR if you want to access AMD's frame gen tech and cannot enable it with native rendering or DLSS upscaling. With that said, FSR 3 also introduces a new native AA mode that applies the temporal anti-aliasing and sharpening component of FSR without upscaling for those after better image quality than what FSR usually brings. While FSR 3's game integration is as simple as a toggle, unfortunately it's not a technology that just works, and this is where we need to start talking about FSR 3's frame pacing and configuration. FSR 3 works differently depending on whether you are using variable refresh rate, aka VRR technology, or not. It also works differently depending on whether you are gaming with VSync on or off. The exact configuration you are using drastically alters the final FSR 3 output quality and the way it paces frames to your display. So let's break it all down. Right now, all VSync off configurations in Forspoken and Immortals of Avium are fundamentally broken with FSR 3 frame generation enabled. Frames are not being paced correctly with VSync disabled, leading to either a blurry or juddery presentation or some combination of both issues. This means that in a VSync off state, FSR 3 really provides no benefit whatsoever. While it does increase the frame rate number you'll see in an FPS counter, the actual visual presentation is no different from using FSR 3 off, and in some cases can be worse. Here is an example of how VSync off with FSR 3 frame generation is pacing frames to the display. You'll have to excuse the low quality slow motion footage here. I don't have a particularly great 1000 FPS camera. Both configurations here are running at approximately 100 FPS with VSync off on a variable refresh rate display. However, we don't seem to be getting a true 100 FPS output with frame generation enabled. Instead, relative to natively rendered 100 FPS, frame generation appears to be outputting frames at a much lower rate. I believe with VSync off that FSR 3 is not properly pacing or displaying half of the frames to the point where it makes little to no difference compared to not using frame generation and simply playing at a lower frame rate. AMD tells us that VSync off in both launch titles is using an older method for handling frame generation in VSync off, older than the version described on their GPU Open website, where it suggests that VSync off should work just fine. I have no idea why an old version of FSR3 would be used to launch the technology if a fix for VSync off is known and implemented in newer code, but here we are. FSR3 frame generation also doesn't work properly with any variable refresh rate configuration when gaming inside your monitor's refresh rate range. Normally when gaming with VRR enabled, your frame rate and monitor's refresh rate are synced to reduce judder and screen tearing from any mismatch. FSR3 breaks this functionality, so when frame generation is enabled, variable refresh no longer works even if it's still enabled. When we view slow motion footage, we can confirm that this is the case. Without frame generation, a 100 FPS output is consistently paced to the display. With frame generation enabled, the monitor's refresh rate counter remains mostly at its maximum, in this case 160 Hz, with the occasional dip to a lower refresh rate, so the 100 FPS output is not synchronized with the refresh rate. This causes frame pacing judder, and as some frames are being shown on screen for a longer time than in a VRR state, it can also lead to increased blur in some situations. However, when we compare this to DLSS 3, we can see that NVIDIA's frame generation technology is correctly and accurately pacing frames and working just fine with variable refresh rates, as you would expect for a 100 FPS output on a 160 Hz monitor. And this is true whether you have an NVIDIA or AMD GPU. Here is some footage from the Radeon RX 7900 XTX running with and without frame generation at a similar frame rate. As you can see, the natively rendered 80 FPS output is more consistently being delivered to the monitor, whereas the frame generation output is juddery. It's also true if you use a frame cap inside your monitor's maximum refresh rate. Native rendering with a 120 FPS cap will switch your VRR capable monitor to run at 120 Hz. With FSR3 frame generation, capping to 120 FPS will still make your monitor run at the maximum refresh rate, in this case 160 Hz, which is a mismatch that causes judder, even though the frame time output graph appears smoother. The only time we saw correct frame pacing was when the frame generation was able to max out the monitor's refresh rate. In practice, this limits the benefit of FSR3 frame generation. The larger the gap in output frame rate and monitor frame rate, the more juddery and unpleasant the FSR3 experience is. While this does work better than VSync off and the actual number of delivered frames is higher than not using frame generation, depending on how low the frame rate is, FSR3 can actually feel less smooth, which defeats the purpose of a technology that is designed to increase the smoothness of the visual presentation. These issues are minimized at higher frame rates and at a closer gap to your monitor's max refresh rate. In my configuration, for example, anything above 130 FPS on my 160 Hz monitor felt quite good and looked clearer than not using frame generation and therefore playing at a lower frame rate. The ideal experience occurs when running at the max refresh rate, but just a little under that still worked pretty well. I found a small improvement when disabling variable refresh rates and running my configuration at a fixed refresh instead with VSync on. My monitor's refresh rate became less erratic, which helped pace frames a little better, but ultimately if you are running FSR3 below your monitor's max refresh rate in this sort of state, there is still a chance of judder, as we know is the case for all fixed refresh rate gaming like this. The same applies as previously, where anything above 130 FPS on my 160 Hz monitor felt pretty good, but anything below that, and especially below 100 FPS, the judder was very noticeable and not ideal. Now AMD tells us that FSR3 was designed for use with VSync on with the goal of maxing out your monitor's refresh rate. They also told us that they had frame pacing working correctly with variable refresh rates in their labs, something I wasn't able to replicate on either NVIDIA or AMD GPUs. My experience seems to align with some other testing I've seen from places like Daniel Owen on YouTube and Tech Power Up, but I have seen other anecdotal reports of smooth output from FSR3 frame generation, so I'm not 100% sure what is going on there. With such a strong focus on VSync on gaming and maxing out your refresh rate, I think AMD hasn't tested variable refresh rate configurations adequately enough and hasn't optimized the experience for what I would say is the most common configuration, VRR gaming, as we would recommend everyone use variable refresh rate technology, especially as pretty much every gaming monitor sold in the past 5 to 7 years supports it. Having to disable VRR or tune settings to max out your monitor's refresh rate feels like an old school approach in a world with widespread variable refresh, sometimes with very high max refreshes like 240Hz or even 540Hz these days. It also quite obviously doesn't run as well as DLSS 3, which in its current state supports variable refresh rates, VSync on and VSync off, all as you would expect. With DLSS 3 frame generation, you can pretty much use any configuration you like, turn on frame generation toggle in the game, and experience properly paced interpolated frames. With FSR 3 frame generation, you'll have to ensure your output frame rate is high enough, probably disable variable refresh rates, and make sure VSync is on. That's too much fiddling around when the direct alternative and competitor technology effectively just works. Now let's talk about the actual quality of FSR 3 frame generation when used in an ideal configuration, such as maxing out your monitor's refresh rate. The quality of interpolated/generated frames is probably the biggest strength of FSR 3 and one aspect that AMD have largely gotten right. The biggest win for FSR 3 frame generation is how FSR handles UI elements. DLSS 3 struggles with this, and while it has improved since launch, there are still titles that don't have perfect handling of UI elements, often featuring garbled, distracting, awful UI in motion. This was by far the most noticeable artifact from Nvidia's frame generation. With FSR 3, I didn't spot any UI issues testing for Spoken or Immortals of Avium. Both games with FSR 3 frame generation handle the UI flawlessly, no garbling, no distracting issues, which eliminates the biggest artifact seen from this technology. Even in a title like Immortals of Avium, which generally has good UI rendering from both FSR 3 and DLSS 3, FSR 3 has the edge. When we look at this semi-transparent UI element, for example, FSR 3 better handles interpolation behind the transparency in motion compared to DLSS 3. This is because FSR 3 has a mode for game developers that fully decouples the UI loop from the frame generation loop. I suspect this is how most games will handle the UI with FSR 3, although AMD did mention there is an option game developers can use to put the UI through the interpolation pass, something I hope is not used if it creates significant artifacting. Like with DLSS 3 frame generation, it's hard to spot any artifacts from the FSR 3 generated frames themselves when the final output frame rate is in the 100 to 120 FPS range or higher, which typically corresponds to a native 60 FPS render rate or higher. While the issues are evident when slowing down the footage and inspecting frame by frame, having these lower quality frames interspersed with higher quality frames significantly reduces their visibility and how noticeable these artifacts are. The higher the frame rate, the shorter each of these frames is being shown. And again, pretty much identically to DLSS 3, FSR 3 frame generation falls apart when used at a low native render rate, especially when taking 30 to 40 FPS and turning it to 60 to 70 FPS. This is not a recommended use case for frame generation, it just doesn't work well here at all. Artifacts in motion are quite noticeable in my opinion, and this substantially reduces visual quality. Having a relatively high output frame rate really is key to ensuring all frame generation tech works well. When more closely assessing the quality of FSR 3 generated frames, I would say their quality is not quite as good as DLSS 3 generated frames, although in practice at a high enough frame rate it's very difficult to tell the difference. Typical pain points for frame generation are any fine details like wires, or in this Immortals of Avium example, chains. When slowed right down, you can see that every second frame has garbled chain detail for both DLSS and FSR frame generation, although DLSS ends up less garbled. Transparency effects trip up frame generation, with FSR 3 again looking a bit blurrier in its generated frames for this magical white effect. Fast complex motion can cause interpolation issues as well. When changing your weapon in Avium, both DLSS 3 and FSR 3 produce a lot of garbling as each frame struggles to deal with the rapid changes in motion. However, on close inspection, the level of garbling is greater on the FSR 3 side, though really neither technology could be described as generating high quality frames in this situation. In many other situations, you'll see similar output from DLSS 3 and FSR 3 frame generation, at least based on the current sample of 1 that we have. For example, simple motion like camera pans or translation generally works well, with both technologies relying on motion vectors to deliver the same level of detail as in real frames. More complex textures and elements like foliage can have issues during simple motion, but I didn't see a clear winner for this between DLSS and FSR. I suspect, like a lot of other implementations of DLSS and FSR, that these quality battles will vary from game to game. While artifacts can be hard to spot with a high enough frame rate, it's pretty clear across both FSR3 games that generated frames are not equivalent to normally rendered frames in quality. Using either DLSS or FSR without frame generation ensures the least amount of artifacting, but with frame generation on, it's rare to get the perfect generated frame. When enabling FSR3, you'll have to accept that the resulting image quality from each frame is reduced to improve the smoothness of the presentation, with a lower quality output compared to rendering the game natively at the same sort of frame rate. But the biggest issue with FSR3 image quality is not the generated frames themselves, it's the quality of FSR upscaling, which AMD tells us has only received very minor improvements, if any, relative to FSR 2.2. This means that in a battle between FSR3 and DLSS 3 frame generation, DLSS typically has noticeably superior image quality, and that's down to DLSS having better upscaled image quality, which ultimately dictates the quality of the real frames that are both shown and input into the interpolation algorithm. So while the difference in generated frame quality isn't all that noticeable at a high frame rate, the overall difference in image quality from upscaling certainly is. Even at a 4K resolution, which we used for all image quality comparisons in this video, in both Forspoken and Immortals of Avium, DLSS upscaling is superior to FSR upscaling, and that impacts the visual presentation for frame generation. In particular, DLSS has greater image stability and less shimmering, as well as occasionally better fine detail reconstruction in motion. Even when pitting DLSS quality mode up against FSR native AA upscaling, DLSS quality was better in both titles evaluated. It simply has better image stability in motion, which is noticeable as both games are heavy on foliage and particle effects. While I didn't extensively test this, I expect the gap to widen, as it typically does when testing lower render resolutions or lower output resolutions. This ends up being the defining difference in image quality between the two techniques. As FSR3 frame generation requires the use of FSR upscaling, you are locked into using that upscaling even if a higher quality technology is available. In a head-to-head battle with DLSS 3 frame generation using DLSS upscaling, FSR3 has lower overall image quality because of this, even though I was okay with the quality of FSR3 generated frames. Until AMD are able to improve the quality of their upscaling component, this gap between AMD and Nvidia tech will remain. The forced use of FSR upscaling with FSR3 frame generation also locks out potentially superior combinations. For example, Nvidia RTX 30 series owners would have a better experience using DLSS upscaling with FSR frame generation, as they can't access DLSS frame generation but they can use DLSS upscaling. I can't imagine AMD wants to give Nvidia owners the best experience with FSR frame generation, hence why they are locking it to FSR upscaling for feature parity across Radeon and GeForce GPUs, but this does end up hurting Radeon owners too, because at the end of the day, a game like Forspoken looks better with native TAA than using FSR upscaling or even the FSR native AA mode. Having access to native rendering plus frame generation, or DLSS plus FSR frame generation, or even XeSS plus FSR3 would be ideal. Lastly, let's talk about latency and FPS output performance. On a Radeon RX 7900 XTX, FSR3 was quite effective at increasing the output FPS. When using the native AA mode in the scene I tested in Immortals of Avium, I went from 43 to 79 FPS, an 83% increase. At the same time, latency decreased due to AMD's built-in latency reducing tech that is applied when frame generation is enabled. So with FSR3 on, I ended up seeing a 23 millisecond drop to latency, noting that the muzzle flash I was testing in Avium isn't instant on mouse click, hence the high overall numbers. Using quality upscaling instead, I saw frame generation increase FPS from 71 to 122, a 72% increase. Latency in this configuration dropped by 8 milliseconds. However, the lowest latency mode here was still rendering at a higher native frame rate. FSR with performance mode upscaling delivered 91 FPS, lower than FSR 3 quality with frame generation, but it had around 10 milliseconds less latency. One interesting discovery is that for compatible Radeon GPUs, currently Anti-Lag Plus doesn't impact latency to any significant degree with FSR 3 enabled. While Anti-Lag Plus does have a big impact for non-frame gen configurations, cutting FSR quality mode latency by 33 milliseconds at the same frame rate, this doesn't apply to frame generation. AMD confirmed these findings, noting that right now Anti-Lag Plus is ineffective in the two FSR 3 launch titles, and the driver-side feature and its corresponding profiles for these games needs more work to properly detect FSR 3 frame generation output. On a GeForce RTX 4090, there was really no latency improvement between frame generation on or off. When using FSR 3 quality, we saw around 105 milliseconds of latency at 84 FPS in the scene tested, and with frame generation, that improved to 140 FPS with 108 milliseconds of latency. The RTX 4090 didn't benefit quite as much from FSR 3 frame generation as the RX 7900 XTX, though the margins between them in terms of percentage uplift weren't massive. A lot of AMD's marketing is focused on FSR 3 providing both a higher frame rate and lower latency than native rendering, which is the same claims that Nvidia makes for DLSS 3 frame generation. However, what we've seen is that the majority of this latency benefit is also from applying just regular upscaling, not from the frame generation component itself, which doesn't improve latency to the same degree as running at a higher native render rate. We therefore end up with the same situation as DLSS frame generation, where it does improve the smoothness of the presentation, but doesn't feel as responsive as true higher frame rate gaming. The real kicker for FSR 3 latency is that Nvidia's current DLSS 3 implementation delivers notably lower latency due to its full integration with Reflex. On an RTX 4090, Reflex provides a solid latency improvement. When using DLSS quality upscaling and no frame generation, Reflex itself reduces latency from 106 to 87 milliseconds. This is a similar benefit we saw from Anti-Lag Plus on the Radeon side, where we went from 122 to 89 milliseconds of latency under similar conditions. But as Reflex works and is always enabled with DLSS 3 frame generation, in our testing we saw an output frame rate of 125 FPS for 90 milliseconds of latency using quality upscaling. FSR 3 without Reflex delivered 140 FPS for 108 milliseconds of latency. So while FSR frame generation was able to increase the frame rate by 67% versus just a 42% increase for DLSS frame generation, DLSS ended up with 18 milliseconds lower latency. This is where the lack of compatibility for FSR 3 with Anti-Lag Plus hurts. The RTX 4090 using Nvidia frame generation tech and Reflex delivered 125 FPS and 90 milliseconds of latency. The RX 7900 XTX using AMD frame generation tech and Anti-Lag Plus delivered 124 FPS with 107 milliseconds of latency. In a best versus best comparison, that gives Nvidia the latency edge until AMD can get Anti-Lag Plus working effectively. And given that you can use Reflex on an Nvidia GPU alongside FSR 3, currently the lowest latency experiences with FSR 3 technology will be on an Nvidia GPU where that tech is integrated. It's not all bad news here. These performance figures do suggest that the optical flow pass in FSR 3 has less overhead than the optical flow pass in DLSS 3, meaning that FSR 3 delivers a higher FPS boost from the same base frame rate. But until latency is equalized, this doesn't result in a better experience from FSR, and won't until upscaling image quality is improved either. So overall, I haven't been very impressed with what I've seen from AMD's FSR 3 technology so far in its two launch titles. To me, this feature seems rushed, incomplete, and not fully ready for prime time. There are too many incompatibilities and configuration issues, which stands out badly compared to Nvidia's DLSS 3 technology, itself a feature with issues. The resulting FSR 3 frame generation experience is difficult to recommend outside a few niche use cases. AMD are already up against it with FSR 3 due to the fundamental nature of frame generation. The same sort of caveats that we talked about with DLSS 3 also apply to FSR 3. To avoid visible artifacts in generated frames, you'll need a base frame rate of at least 60 FPS with a final output around 100 to 120 FPS. And given that frame generation does not improve latency, for that true high refresh rate experience, you'll want a base frame rate of 100 to 120 FPS with a final output above 200 FPS for the responsiveness we typically associate with the best gaming experiences. This is why we refer to frame generation as a feature that enhances the game's smoothness rather than something that improves overall performance. The benefits are entirely visual in nature. If you're a gamer that doesn't have the GPU performance to hit those frame rate targets, then frame generation, whether that's DLSS or FSR, isn't going to deliver a very good experience. If you're a gamer that is only playing at 60 FPS but wants to improve that to a true high refresh rate experience, frame generation isn't properly capable of that. If you're a multiplayer gamer that specifically wants to increase frame rates to access lower latencies and increase responsiveness to make you more competitive, frame generation is useless for that. FSR 3 is no better than DLSS 3 at any of those aspects that, right now, are fundamental to frame generation. Where AMD stumbles is they've taken a feature that already has somewhat limited usability and have limited it further. Not only do you now need to worry about base frame rates, but you'll also have to ensure you've set up VSync correctly and are pumping out enough frames to avoid judder. You'll have to be satisfied with sacrificing proper variable refresh rate functionality to access frame generation, and variable refresh is a feature we strongly recommend that every gamer uses. There are situations where that trade-off alone is not worth it, as FSR 3 can be less smooth than not using it, defeating the whole purpose of a technology designed to improve smoothness. That's not to say FSR 3 never works well. If you have a reasonably high output frame rate and are running at or near your monitor's maximum refresh rate with VSync on, the FSR 3 frame generation experience can be smoother and better than not using frame gen. But when we have DLSS 3 frame generation that, to use an NVIDIA-ism, just works with features like VRR, going backwards on compatibility with FSR 3 really stands out. AMD have clearly put a lot of work into ensuring the frame generation part of the technology works well, with fast and effective interpolation. It has lower overhead than DLSS 3 frame generation, it has zero issues rendering UI that we've seen so far, the general quality of interpolated frames is acceptable, and it works across all graphics cards, no special hardware required. That's a big win for FSR 3. It's the most impressive aspect of what AMD has produced, and it provides a solid foundation for improvement. But all that great work that's been put into generating frames is let down by AMD's inferior upscaling technology, which you are locked into using with FSR 3 frame generation. The overall image quality, factoring in generated frames and normal frames, is simply better from DLSS 3, and that's largely down to NVIDIA's upscaler. Without substantial improvement to FSR upscaling, especially at lower resolutions, DLSS 3 will continue to offer a better overall package than FSR 3. FSR 3 is also let down on the latency front with its incompatibility with Anti-Lag Plus at the moment, meaning that DLSS 3, when run on an NVIDIA GPU, delivers lower latency at the same output frame rate than FSR 3 does on an AMD GPU. The two most relevant comparisons, as NVIDIA owners will use DLSS 3 and AMD owners FSR 3. The gulf widens for Radeon RX 6000 series owners which can't even use Anti-Lag Plus at all, and owners of older NVIDIA GPUs will be praying for reflex in FSR 3 titles as the built-in latency reducing tech in FSR 3 isn't overly effective. Now, AMD has said that some of these issues will be improved. They're working on Anti-Lag Plus compatibility, VSync off has been fixed in a newer version of FSR 3, and they're aware of VRR compatibility issues. But some of these problems really should have been resolved before launch, so that when the tech debuts, it launches with a bang and everyone that turns it on is treated to a great experience. Instead, it seems to me that AMD rushed the feature out the door to make a September launch deadline, alleviating pressure that was put on themselves by announcing FSR 3 far too early. But I can only evaluate FSR 3 on what is in front of me right now, which is integration into two publicly available games with plenty of issues. If you can use FSR 3 to max out your monitor, I think the experience will be pretty good for you, and I'd probably recommend giving it a try at least. If that's not possible, it's pretty hard to justify using right now, even in situations where I might recommend someone use DLSS 3. And that's really the current state of FSR3. It isn't overly competitive with DLSS 3 and doesn't do much to close the feature gap between AMD and Nvidia, even if we ignore the large difference in the number of supported titles. It needs significantly more work to be at that level. But the good news is that provided AMD actually allocate resources to improve FSR3, it should be possible to get it to that level. Solve the frame pacing and VRR compatibility issues, get it working with Anti-Lag Plus, and perhaps the most difficult of all, improve the quality of FSR upscaling, and FSR3 would be the gold standard for frame generation technology given its low overhead and broad compatibility. I hope AMD can get it to that level. Anyway, that's it for our little look at FSR3 for the moment in the 2 games where it is supported. We will continue to assess this technology as it is integrated into more games and whether or not AMD fixes some of the things that we've brought to their attention and things that they are already aware of in the launch version. We're also going to be assessing the new driver AMD Fluid Motion Frames feature in an upcoming video, so stay tuned for that. We'll be taking a look and see how the non-game integrated version works. If you do want to stay tuned for that video, then the best way is to subscribe, get it in your inbox when that video is ready. And also you can support the channel directly via our Patreon or Floatplane accounts. Links are in the description below. If you really appreciate these sorts of in-depth analysis, it does take a while to make this sort of video, so we do rely on the direct support from our Patreon and Floatplane members. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.